Okay, so to kind of pick up where we left off yesterday in the notes, talking about these different methods that we found for solving quadratics and which ones are the best ones to use. Remember at this point, we have not covered the completing the square, so that's not an option. But as far as the other ones go, thinking about the only time that we would use the graphing is if we have a graphing calculator handy and we're comfortable with that. Remember when there's no x term, when I have just something like x squared, maybe minus 9 equals 0, then that's a good time to use square roots when there's just an x squared term. Factoring, if you're comfortable with factoring, and it's something that is easy to do and you see it quickly. Otherwise, don't spend a lot of time on those other methods when we now have this quadratic formula, which always works. Remember, I called this one the go-to, okay? So this is one that works all the time. So when in doubt, if you have to solve a quadratic, know that the quadratic formula always works. So you need to make sure that you've memorized that negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Okay? You need to know that quadratic formula because it always works. So in today's lesson, we're going to kind of look a little bit, as we get going here, a little bit more at just this b squared minus 4ac and what that can be used for all by itself. Okay? So in that quadratic formula, this b squared minus 4ac piece is what we call the discriminant. Okay? And the discriminant has some uses. What we can use that discriminant for is to determine how many real number solutions the equation is going to have before we get into doing any of the work. Okay? So down here in the key concept, we've got a breakdown of how this works. If that b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, if it's positive, then that tells me that I'm going to have two real solutions. That if I were to see the graph, I would know the graph would hit the x-axis in two locations. Right? If I take that discriminant b squared minus 4ac and it's equal to 0, it comes out to be exactly 0, then that tells me that there's only going to be one real solution to my equation. Okay? And that's because, remember, this b squared minus 4ac is under the radical. So if it turns out to be 0, I've just got the square root of 0, which is only going to leave the negative b divided by 2a. Okay? And if that discriminant turns out to be less than 0, it turns out to be negative, then that means that there are going to be no real number solutions, that the graph is never touching the x-axis, and therefore there are no solutions. So if I'm just curious as to how many solutions I should have to an equation, the discriminant is the way to go. It simply tells you how many solutions your equation is going to have. If it's positive, I'll get two solutions. If it's 0, that means one solution. And if it turns out to be negative, that means there are no real numbered solutions. So we'll just look at this quick example here. Wanting to know how many real number solutions does 2x squared minus 3x equals negative 5 have? Well, just like everything else with solving these quadratics, the first thing is that we have to put it in standard form. So I'm going to have to add the 5 to both sides and get 2x squared minus 3x plus 5 equals 0. So now I'm going to look at my discriminant. My discriminant, remember, is the b squared minus 4ac. So b squared would be negative 3 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 5. So that gives me 9 minus 4 times 2 is 8, times 5 is 40. So 9 minus 40 is negative 31, which is less than 0. And since it is less than 0, that tells me that this equation has no real solutions. Okay? So just using that discriminant, comparing it to 0, and remember less than 0 means no solutions, equal to 0 means there'd be one solution, and greater than 0 means I would have two solutions to my equation. So try the got it problem. How many real number solutions does 6x squared minus 5x equals 7 have? So again, we need to put that in standard form. 6x squared minus 5x would be minus 7 equals 0. So when I do my discriminant, I'm going to have b squared, so negative 5 squared minus 4 times a times c. Okay, so that's going to give me positive 25, and then negative minus 4 times 6 times 7 is going to give me 168, and that's going to be a negative 168, and the negative negative turns out to be a positive. So 25 plus 168 is going to be 193, which is greater than 0, which means that that equation has two solutions. Okay? Now notice it doesn't tell me what the solutions are, it just tells me how many there's going to be. Okay? So go ahead and try problems 7 and 8 here listed underneath the practice and see how many solutions each of those equations will have. Okay? If we look at 7, it's in standard form. So the b squared, there is no b, which means b is 0, minus 4 times a times c, which is negative 15, and that gives me positive 60, which is greater than 0, which means that equation will have two real number solutions. Okay. Problem number 8. I'd have b squared, which is 12 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 9, times c, which is 4. So I have 144 minus 4 times 9 is 36, and 36 times 4 is 144. So I end up with 0, which is equal to 0, which means I'm going to have one solution to that equation. So tomorrow in class we'll do some more practice with discriminant and with using the quadratic formula, so make sure you're working on memorizing that quadratic formula, and we'll see you then.